I titled this video Cultural Fluency. And so cultural fluency doesn't really have one specific definition, but it's basically understanding the culture behind the language, the reasons why people act in a certain way, the inside jokes and cultural references, the reasons why we may use a certain phrase or expression in order to express a certain thought, in order to say things a certain way. And a lot of times native speakers do this automatically because we're not thinking, oh, this may not make sense to somebody who's outside the culture. I've caught myself a few times having conversations where I use an expression that like is a cultural reference to a TV show or a movie that's 30 or 40 years old. And even I may not have seen this movie, but these are things that become part of our cultural legacy. And so these are things that I know a lot of non-native speakers, especially at the more advanced levels, which are the people that generally are watching my videos. I know you may feel a little confused by these references because I know I feel that way when I'm traveling outside of the United States. So the thing that's important to understand about cultural fluency is that it requires you to be open-minded as well as curious about the differences between your culture and the culture that you're studying, the culture that you're living in, the culture that you're interested in. So you have to have this curiosity and this kind of sensitivity to your own culture and how it influences the way you perceive other cultures. So it requires you to acknowledge and respect those differences, even if you disagree with them. And so that's always interesting when I see comments on different YouTube channels and when people are doing something that's totally culturally appropriate in American culture or other English-speaking cultures, but people from completely different backgrounds are like, oh my goodness, why are you doing this? Because it's something that may not fit into their particular culture. So I would love to have a conversation about these deeper cultural messages and in cultural understandings. And so the thing about cultural fluency is that you have to be able to recognize that you see and interpret someone's actions and behaviors through your own cultural lens, depending on all kinds of factors like our background, our cultural background, our religious backgrounds, our educational backgrounds, our regional backgrounds, where we grew up. If you grew up in the city, you grew up in a more rural area, whether you grew up in a subculture of your culture, subculture of the United States, whatever it is, we are always interpreting how people are acting based on the way we grew up. A lot of times we talk about it as cultural programming or cultural conditioning, and it is kind of a more sociological, anthropological topic, but it's something I feel like is completely necessary in order to have a deeper conversation about how language works. And so I always try to include this kind of cultural viewpoint in my videos, but I'm not perfect. No one's perfect. And so I always welcome you to ask questions. That's why I have a couple of videos on, appropriate forms of address. And a lot of times that's what I mean by my politeness videos. It's not that I think this is the best way for you to express yourself, but it's helpful to understand that if you don't use these polite forms of address, or you don't use this polite language, or you don't understand intonation, people may misinterpret what you're saying because they don't have their own self-awareness of your cultural lens and why it may be a language thing. So these are definitely things I want to continue to talk about with you guys going forward. So like I said, we often do it imperfectly. And so I wanted to share a little bit of language that we may or may not define in today's live stream, but things that I want you to think about with regards to cultural fluency. So we talk about cultural gaffes, Gaffes. Cultural gaffes are when we make mistakes because we don't have an understanding of the culture, or we just don't know that it's different in another culture, and we all do them. Doesn't matter. We even do them regionally when we go to different places. A lot of times we also call these faux pas, which is a French phrase that we've Americanized. And these are mistakes that we make that are kind of embarrassing and make you feel like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I did that. I'm already having memories coming back to me of things that I've done that have been culturally a little embarrassing. And then we also talk about cultural awareness, being aware of different cultures, different cultural approaches, the fact that, we may not understand all of the different subcultures within our own country, understanding that people who are from different countries or whose relatives or their ancestors are from different countries may have traditions that are different than ours. And we also talk about cultural sensitivity, which is being aware that the way we see things is not always the way other people see things, and that we need to understand that our beliefs do not necessarily mean other people have to behave in that way. So it is quite a complex topic, and I just wanted to kind of try it today and see if we could come up with an idea, some ideas of things that you guys are most interested in talking about. And so basically all of these topics are what we call cross-cultural communication. And if you're feeling like, oh my goodness, Kim, like there's so much I need to learn, there's so much that I don't know, or I feel stressed by this, don't worry. There are entire industries devoted to cross-cultural communication. A lot of high-level professionals, executives, they have to learn cross-cultural communication in order to interact in business situations, in order to communicate with other people. Because this is my background, I'm often telling other people and my family and friends, we're trying to explain different cultures, different understandings of cultures that I've experienced or lived in, because we all have these different viewpoints, these different cultural lenses with which we see the world. So it is definitely something that's an ongoing conversation. It's imperfect. There's a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of mistakes happening in the US with regards to culture and not respecting other cultures or expecting people to act a certain way, even though it's not their culture. And so it's just something to be aware of, that this is an ongoing conversation, among people who are living in this global society. So I personally think it's pretty awesome, because we have so many opportunities today to meet people from other cultures, to talk about different things, to learn about different perspectives. And that's why I like these live streams, is it's a chance for us to interact, for us to talk, to exchange stories. That's why I have the Conversations with Kim series, where a lot of those questions are about hearing your perspectives and being able to share what the viewpoint I have on the world through my experience as an American. So it's a really, really fun topic. So let's talk about a few aspects of cultural fluency that you may need to be aware of. And I'll probably answer your questions about American culture as we continue with this live stream, because I haven't come up with my specific viewpoint on what's normal in American culture. That's why I want to know what your questions are. So some things that we talk about with cultural fluency can be physical behaviors, such as cheek kisses or body language, the way we move our bodies, or hand gestures, or smiling or waving, and so on. So, for example, when I first moved to Argentina, one of the first things I had to learn how to do and feel natural doing was giving cheek kisses or air kisses, depending on the term people use, because in the United States, you don't approach somebody and give them a little cheek to cheek kiss. It's like kind of awkward to do so. And I have a friend from my time in Argentina where we would do the cheek kiss because it was part of the culture, but she always was like stiff and awkward because she was from New York, or she is from New York. And she was like, this is weird, like stop getting so close to me. So I had to learn to do the cheek kiss. And then those of you watching may be thinking, oh, that's so normal in my culture. Or, some people have one, sometimes it's two, sometimes it's three. All of these cultural behaviors lead to this level of cultural fluency, and be able to know what people are, to be able to anticipate and be able to respond when people are acting in such a way, and because it's weird if you're not used to it. I often tell this story that of one of my classes. It was actually my business English class where we were talking about this topic, and one of my students from Brazil was talking about when he met a student from Korea, and they were housemates in their homestay in Boston, and he went to give her a huge hug and a kiss, and she was completely terrified, because that is not how you greet someone you don't know in Korean culture. And those of you watching may be able to relate to that story. So this cultural fluency is something that we often learn between different cultures. Like I said, body language and hand gestures. A lot of showing you're listening in American culture is using your body, using your expressions, using your hands. I've actually tried to make sure when I do record videos that I'm showing you, like, we talk with our hands here, so that you kind of get used to that, because other cultures don't. They're more stiff, or it's disrespectful to use your hands, that kind of thing. Hand gestures. There are hand gestures that Americans make that are incredibly rude in other cultures, so that's definitely a topic for another video. Smiling. Americans naturally smile, but if we go to Europe or a lot of South American countries, it's awkward. Like, why is that person smiling at me? Or they see it as an invitation in a way that is not intended. So I have to unlearn my natural smiling behavior when I travel, because I don't want to give people the wrong impression. So there's a lot of things that are cultural fluency that isn't necessarily language related, but is part of learning a language. Other aspects of cultural fluency we can talk about are attitudes, like the way people handle punctuality and politeness. Punctuality is one of my favorite topics because it really does vary across cultures, and it is a big problem for people in the United States or people who come to the United States if they're not used to this more rigid level of what time means and what does it mean to be on time. It's something you often have to learn. It can also be behaviors like tipping someone when you eat at a restaurant or you get a drink at a bar, and whether or not, like, what's the right amount to tip? Is it normal to tip? Should you be tipping your taxi driver or the person who helps you at a hotel? All of these things are related to cultural fluency. Could be holding the door open for people. Do men hold the door open for women? Do women hold the door open for men? Do you not hold the door open for anybody? It could be offering a seat on the bus to older people, pregnant women, children, depending on the culture. And sometimes it can be, completely polite to offer a seat to someone who is older than you, if you just perceive they're a little bit older than you. But in American culture, it's like only when you're significantly older. So there can be some awkwardness where the person's like, well, why are you offering me a seat? Like, there's all kinds of things that can happen with that kind of cultural fluency. And so there can also be appropriate topics of conversation. That's pretty much where I've gone with this on this channel. Topics of conversation that are appropriate, questions that are okay to ask, what you can ask different people in different situations, what is okay to talk about at work and what's okay to talk about casually. A lot of questions that I often think about, they're kind of obvious, but maybe not, because in some cultures you want to know if someone's older than you, and in order to show them more respect, so you ask them, how old are you? And in American culture, it's like so rude to ask somebody their age because I don't know, we have this weirdness about age. So you would never ask somebody like that. Like asking someone, are you married? If they have kids together, are you married? That's not something we ask. There are a lot of people who have kids together and aren't married. Look at all the celebrities. So you have to be careful asking a lot of these questions in a lot of situations. So I'm so curious to hear what you feel comfortable asking, or when you feel like you've made a mistake, because that's something that's important to understand. Also, topics of conversation, sometimes it can feel awkward if there's just this really common topic that we talk about. Like, for example, in the Boston area, people talk a lot about sports because the Boston area sports teams are really important for the local culture. So you can feel completely lost if you're in the Boston area, and there are lots of international students and professionals living in the Boston area. It's a very international city. However, if you don't have this local understanding, you can feel like, oh my gosh, I don't understand how to interact. So that's part of cultural fluency, as well as how people celebrate certain holidays or maintain traditions with their families or their religion or their cultural traditions, or how they share meals. That's something that is often very interesting between cultures. Like a lot of times I feel like Americans, we eat so quickly. In other cultures, it's savored and it's a slower meal. Americans are used to kind of rushing through their meals from when we're in school. We just don't have that much time to eat lunch. And so a lot of times my friends are like, why are you eating so fast? Like, slow down. Let's enjoy our meal. And so, it can be things like, it also makes me think with meals, like using your cell phone at meals. That's something that's an ongoing debate in culture right now. So these are all things that we can start trying to analyze beyond the language, because you can be completely fluent in a language but have no cultural fluency if you don't understand or ask yourself or kind of pay attention to these kind of things. And the other things I mentioned is that we can talk about cultural fluency and how we make invitations, who we invite when we make invitations, how we show respect. Actually, thinking of invitations, I think about, like, I've heard that when in some cultures, if you admire someone's possession, they'll give it to you. And that happened to me with one of my friends. I said, oh, I really like your scarf. And she's like, oh, I'll give it to you. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so unusual, because we don't usually do that in American culture. I still love that scarf, still wear it today. But it's just, these are things that we learn as we become more fluent in another culture, because we live there, or we study it, or we travel. So these are things, it's a constantly evolving conversation that you're going to have with yourself as you continue to evolve learning a language and learning about a culture. So that's basically some ideas of things you may have questions about. I wanted to give you some ideas of what I would love to talk about in future videos so that we can go deeper into these questions. So my questions for you are, what do you do to improve your cultural fluency? What do you do to improve your cultural fluency with American culture or other English-speaking cultures or cultures from all over the world? What are some things that you do? I'd love to hear this. And then what bothers you about how people interpret your culture? What are some misunderstandings that you think people have about your culture? Like I said, not everyone's culturally sensitive. There's plenty of stories of Americans who go abroad and do things that are terribly offensive and disrespectful. And I'm very sorry about that. But like, that's one of those things that we kind of become culturally ambassadors of our culture, our country and our culture when we travel, or even when we interact in public settings, like on YouTube. You know, if you're representing your country, the way you represent your country when you leave comments gives somebody an understanding of how people act in your culture. Even if it's unusual, like this person's not standard, we make these assumptions. It's this big problem. So I would love to hear if you have any concerns about how people interpret your culture or your country's behavior based on things. I mean, the United States right now is having a lot of issues, and it's one of those things I often say to my family, you know, I say, people abroad, this is just so embarrassing, some of the things that are happening in American culture, but that's reality, right? And then what are your biggest questions about American culture? What are the things you really want to understand? What are things that you find confusing? I received a question recently about topics, everyday conversation topics, and what people often talk about. You know, talking about different types of food, local foods or American foods, because a lot of times people think American food is like hamburgers and fries or something like that. But it isn't necessarily. But people have a lot of opinions about pizza, for example. We have a lot of opinions about certain types of coffee or tea or things like that, things that people experience on a daily basis. So I'd love to hear, you know, what kind of questions do you have about American culture? What would you love to understand more about American culture? You know, if I could be your guide for this, because obviously I'm answering from my own experiences when I do answer these questions, but I would love to know, you know, what are these questions that you have? What are the things, especially for those of you who have, you know, interacted a lot with Americans, whether that's in your country or living in the US, because I know a lot of people do live in the US or Canada. What are things that you end up having these questions about that you don't understand? You feel like you're unprepared in those situations. That's a great thing for me to be able to help you with. Yeah, and so similarly, what can't you understand? Like, what just doesn't make sense or it's really hard for you to accept about American culture? And last but not least, what are you afraid to ask? Obviously, if you don't feel confident leaving a comment on this video or in the live stream, no problem, send me an email. But a lot of times we feel embarrassed that we don't know something or that we're having an interpretation about something. So I hope you know from all of my videos that you can feel comfortable asking me this question. I believe in open-mindedness and being able to talk about things that are uncomfortable at times, but I do understand that you may not want to post these questions publicly. So go to englishwithkim.com and you can email me from there or respond to my emails, and I'll be happy to answer these questions. But I'm really curious to hear what kind of questions people have, because I feel like not being inside the classroom, I'm not having these conversations. Having this online platform is very different than being in the classroom where these conversations arise more organically. So I'd love to hear what kind of questions you guys have. Okay, so I'm going to check over with the live chat. If you like this topic of a video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and leave comments and share it with anybody who may be interested in this topic. It's definitely an ongoing conversation I want to have on this channel, but it'd be great to hear from you guys, your feedback, because obviously you might need some time to think about it. It's not something we can just immediately be able to have a deep conversation about. Even me, I might need to do some research and understand my own culture. Basically, this is just me kind of testing out this idea for a future series on cultural fluency. Obviously, I do need your questions in order to be able to do this series. So that's why I wanted to start it as a live stream to kind of see if this is something you guys want to know more about or something that you have questions about. Because like I said, a lot of times we see things from within the lens of our own culture, and it's hard to know what things are confusing or what things you don't understand. I think that's a lot of times why people do tend to teach things like idioms or expressions, because we can kind of tell you what those things mean in the context. But a lot of times, the cultural fluency comes from having this deeper understanding, paying attention to the kind of language that's being used in TV shows and movies, trying to understand why people say things in certain settings. And that's why I often talk about paying attention to context. A lot of times I can't tell you what something means without knowing the contexts in which you heard it, because we say things related to the situation. And that's why tone is absolutely essential when we're talking about cultural fluency. It's really, really important to understand why people say things a certain way, what the tone means, what the person was trying to express to you, and what your relationship was, what was the attitude in the conversation. So I just want to encourage you to think more about that and think about what your questions are on that topic so that I can hopefully answer them in the future. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me for this live video. I hope that you found it interesting and helpful, just opening up the conversation about cultural fluency. Looking forward to talking more about it in the future. If you think of questions and answer the questions, I will put in the description below the video, and I'm happy to take into consideration all of the questions you have about American culture, about understanding different behaviors that people have, the way we use certain body language, the things that people would like to, I don't know, like just the way people act, the way we look at each other, smiling, what does it mean? Any question you can think of is totally, there's no silly question. All questions are good because it has to do with our own experiences and how we understand the way people move within a different culture. So I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. So thank you guys so much for joining me. Once again, I'm Kim from EnglishWithKim.com. I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend. I would love to invite other people into this conversation with us. Have a good one. Goodbye.